Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
My mother met my stepfather when I was 17. She was vulnerable after my father passed away from cancer, and this man swooped in like a knight in shining armor. At first, he seemed perfect, successful carpenter, well-spoken, and apparently devoted to my mother. I should have seen the red flags when he kept trying to rush their relationship, but I was dealing with my own grief and preparing for college. They married just after I started my freshman year. That's when everything changed. It was like a switch flipped in his head the moment the marriage certificate was signed. The mask came off, revealing a controlling, cruel man who had zero interest in being a father figure to either me or my younger sister. While I was away at college, my sister would call me, crying about how he'd scream at her for the smallest things. She was only 13 when they got married, and she had to endure his daily emotional abuse. When I asked her how bad things were that day, she told me through her tears that he had thrown a fit because she left a glass in the sink instead of putting it in the dishwasher right away. He had called her worthless and said she'd never amount to anything. When I asked if she had told our mother about this, she explained that Mom just told her to try harder, not to upset him. My sister admitted she didn't know how much more she could take. The worst part was watching our mother slowly transform from the confident, loving woman she once was into this shell of herself who walked on eggshells in her own home. She worked full-time but still did everything around the house because he claimed it was women's work. She bought all the groceries, all the household items, all the good quality stuff, while he kept his pre-marriage bachelor junk around like some kind of trophy. My relationship with my mother became strained over the years. When I confronted her about his treatment of my sister, pointing out that she was just a kid, my mother defended him. She insisted we didn't understand how hard he worked, and that we just needed to be more considerate of his needs. When I questioned her about her own needs and my sister's needs, she just begged me not to make things harder than they already were. This went on for 18 long years. 18 years of watching him tear down my mother's self-esteem, of hearing my sister's tears over the phone, of gritting my teeth through holiday dinners where he'd inevitably find something to explode about. But everyone has their breaking point. For my mother, it came after he threw a tantrum over her buying the wrong brand of coffee. She called me that evening, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, I heard determination in her voice. She told me she was done and couldn't do it anymore. When I asked if she was sure, she explained that he was going on a business trip next week and wanted my sister and me to help her move out while he was gone. We planned everything meticulously. The moment his car left the driveway for his week-long trip, we sprang into action. We only took what our mother had paid for: the expensive cookware, the high-quality bedding, the plush towels she'd bought with her own money. We left all his cheap bachelor stuff behind: the threadbare towels, the mismatched dishes, the worn-out furniture he'd brought into the marriage. When we were doing our final sweep of the house, a deliciously petty idea struck me. My mother had always bought all the household supplies, including every single roll of toilet paper in that house. I called my sister over and asked her to help me gather all the toilet paper. When she asked what I meant by all of it, I explained that I wanted every single roll, from every bathroom, every closet, even the ones on the holders. We stripped that house of every square of toilet paper, giggling like school children the entire time. It felt silly, but after years of his emotional abuse, this small act of rebellion felt incredibly satisfying. What happened next was better than anything we could have planned. We found out through my mother's attorney that our stepfather had returned home early from his trip with a severe case of diarrhea. He rushed to the downstairs bathroom only to find no toilet paper. Desperate, he ran upstairs to check the other 2 bathrooms. Same situation. In his panic, he ended up destroying 2 bathrooms and ruining several of his old crusty towels before he even noticed the rest of what was missing from the house. When my mother's attorney told us this story during their divorce proceedings, my sister and I couldn't stop laughing. My mother tried to look disapproving, but I caught her hiding a smile. My sister remarked that he finally got what he deserved, and I added that after all the emotional crap he put us through over the years, it seemed fitting that actual crap was his downfall. The divorce proceedings went surprisingly smoothly after that. I think he was too embarrassed about the bathroom incident to put up much of a fight. He's still living in that house with his bachelor quality belongings, hopefully with a better supply of toilet paper this time. I've been working as a senior software developer at this tech company for 3 years now, and everything was fine until 6 months ago when our previous project manager got promoted and this new guy took over. From day one, this guy was a nightmare. He'd strut around the office like he owned the place, wearing his fancy suits and constantly reminding everyone about his MBA from some prestigious university. The real problem wasn't his attitude, though. It was his complete lack of understanding of how software development actually works. He'd make impossible demands, like wanting features added hours before release without any testing, or demanding we rewrite entire systems overnight because he had a better idea. When anyone tried to explain why these demands were unreasonable, he'd pull the "I'm the boss" card and threaten to write them up for insubordination. Things really started going downhill when he began taking credit for our team's successes while blaming us for his poor planning. He'd show up to client meetings with completely different specifications than what we'd agreed on, promising impossible deadlines, without consulting any of us. The breaking point came last week. We had a major project due for our biggest client, and he'd been sabotaging our progress for weeks with his constant changes and micromanagement. The day before the deadline, he announced that he'd promised the client a completely new set of features that weren't in the original scope. During our morning meeting, he started berating our team in front of everyone. He went off about how our incompetence was unbelievable and that we couldn't even follow his simple instructions. When I pointed out that his so-called simple instructions would require at least 3 weeks of development and testing, he dismissed it, saying it wasn't his problem and demanding we make it happen by tomorrow. I tried explaining how it was literally impossible, but he cut me off, refusing to hear what he called excuses and declaring that our team was failing because we were all lazy and incompetent. That's when I'd had enough. I pulled up my email inbox on the projector and started showing every single email where I'd warned him about the timeline issues, his constant requirement changes, and the technical limitations we'd discussed. I had documented everything. I walked everyone through each instance, pointing out where he'd changed the database structure 3 days before launch, where he'd promised features we explicitly said were impossible in the time frame, and where he'd ignored our security concerns. The other team members started chiming in with their own documented evidence. His face got redder and redder as we exposed every bad decision, every ignored warning, every instance of his incompetence. He tried to end the meeting and ordered everyone back to work, but I stood my ground. I told him we weren't done and that the client needed to know why their project was delayed and that it wasn't because of this team. That's when he completely lost it. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a handgun, pointing it directly at me. He started taunting me, asking if I wanted to keep pushing and if I thought I was so smart. The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. I managed to press the silent alarm button under my desk while maintaining eye contact with him. I tried to reason with him, telling him to put the gun down and that he was throwing his life away over a project meeting. He just screamed at me to shut up, ranting about how I thought I could humiliate him and claiming he built this team. Fortunately, our building security team arrived within minutes, along with the police. They managed to talk him down and arrest him. Turns out he didn't even have a permit for the gun. The aftermath was better than I could have imagined. Not only was he fired and charged with multiple felonies, but our company's legal team discovered he had been falsifying reports to upper management and embezzling project funds. The investigation revealed he had done similar things at his previous jobs, but had always managed to leave before getting caught. He's now facing serious prison time for the gun incident, embezzlement, and fraud. His precious MBA and connections couldn't save him this time. I heard his wife left him and he had to sell his fancy house and car to pay for legal fees. Our team got a new project manager who actually listens to us and understands software development. The client was understanding once they learned what had happened, and we were given a realistic timeline to complete the project properly. Being a police officer wasn't my first career choice. I actually started out wanting to be a firefighter, but after a ride along with my uncle who was a police sergeant, something just clicked. The way he handled difficult situations with both authority and compassion made me realize that's what I wanted to do. After graduating from the police academy, I spent 5 years working in a busy metropolitan area before transferring to a smaller suburban department where I could have more meaningful interactions with the community. That day started like any other. I was working the morning shift when the call came in about a high-speed pursuit of a stolen vehicle. I wasn't part of the chase itself, but I was called to help secure the perimeter after the crash. By the time I arrived, it was already a grim scene. The car had rolled multiple times into a field beside the road, ending up on its roof about 50 yards from the pavement. The driver, who hadn't been wearing a seatbelt, was thrown from the vehicle and landed about 200 feet away. A yellow tarp had been placed over the body while we waited for the medical examiner. My job was to help redirect traffic. We had the road completely blocked off in both directions, setting up orange cones and patrol cars with flashing lights. Most people were understanding once they saw all the emergency vehicles and the mangled car in the field. Sure, some were annoyed about having to take a detour, but they moved along without much fuss. Then this woman in a luxury SUV pulled up. From the moment she stopped, I could tell she was going to be trouble. The woman immediately started questioning me about what had happened and if it was serious. I responded by telling her she needed to turn her vehicle around and follow the detour signs. She protested, claiming she had an important appointment and asking how long the road would be closed. I told her that it would be several hours and again asked her to use the alternate route. She didn't move her car. Instead, she kept craning her neck, trying to see past me into the field. She began asking more detailed questions about the accident, wanting to know if anyone was hurt, if children were involved, and what had happened to the driver. I told her that I couldn't discuss details of an ongoing investigation and once again asked her to turn around. She wouldn't let up, insisting that, as a member of the community, she had a right to know what had happened. I repeated my request for her to respect the privacy of those involved and follow the detour. She continued staring into the field, her eyes darting between the overturned car and the yellow tarp in the distance. Then she smiled, as if she'd just figured something out, and commented with relief that at least everyone was okay. I just stared at her for a moment, tired of her persistence and feeling a surge of frustration at her assumption. I bluntly told her that they weren't okay. Her smile faltered as she asked for confirmation of what I just said, still trying to peer around me and practically hanging out of her car window. That's when I delivered the harsh truth, that the person had died. That's when she finally noticed the yellow tarp in the field, and the reality of what she was looking at hit her. Her face went pale and she let out a dramatic gasp, both hands flying to cover her mouth. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she started hyperventilating. Without another word, she pulled her car over to the shoulder, parked, and had what I can only describe as a complete meltdown. She sat there sobbing and shaking for a good 15 minutes, while other officers continued directing traffic around her. Eventually, she collected herself enough to drive away, but I could see her hands trembling on the steering wheel. I probably could have been gentler in delivering the news, but sometimes people need a harsh dose of reality. She was so determined to satisfy her morbid curiosity that she couldn't just trust us to do our jobs and move along. Instead, she had to push and push until she got an answer she wasn't prepared to handle. I still think about her sometimes when I'm working accident scenes, and I've used that experience to develop better ways of dealing with overly curious onlookers. But that day, I admit I felt a bit of satisfaction in teaching her why sometimes it's better not to know. After graduating with my degree in environmental science, I found myself moving to this charming little mountain town to be closer to my aging grandmother. The job market wasn't exactly booming for environmental scientists there, so I took what I could get, a barista position at the local Starbucks. The town itself was a tourist hotspot, drawing in wealthy visitors from the nearby big city who'd come to escape the urban chaos for a weekend. Most of them were actually pretty decent folks, believe it or not. I've been working the closing shift for about 6 months, which was perfect for me since I could spend my mornings helping my grandmother with her doctor's appointments and errands. But then my manager asked me to switch to morning shifts. She said they needed someone reliable during their busiest hours, and apparently I fit the bill. The pay bump was nice, so I agreed, even though it meant rearranging my whole schedule. My first morning shift started normally enough. The sunrise was beautiful over the mountains, and the morning rush was just beginning to trickle in. That's when he walked in. This guy in what looked like a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, with his tiny, perfectly groomed Pomeranian trotting beside him without a leash. The dog was adorable, I'll give him that. All fluffy and well-behaved, but definitely not a service animal. There wasn't a vest, harness, or any indication that this was anything other than a pet. Now we had signs clearly posted on every entrance stating service animals only, but this guy walked in like he owned the place. He barely looked at me while ordering, simply stating that he wanted a cappuccino in a mug. I told him the price and he inserted his card, then immediately turned and walked away to sit on one of our couches, leaving his card still in the reader. I tried calling out to him about his forgotten card, but he just kept walking, acting like he couldn't hear me. The customer behind him, this nice elderly lady, kindly pointed out that the gentleman had left his card in the machine. I took the card out and noticed it was one of those fancy metal ones that probably had no spending limit. Once his cappuccino was ready, I decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, return his card, and politely remind him about our pet policy. Walking over to where he sat, his dog now freely roaming over our expensive couches, I placed his drink on the table. I handed him his card and politely told him about our service animals only policy, suggesting that we had a lovely patio area where he could sit with his dog instead. His reaction was immediate and explosive. He started yelling that his dog was indeed a service dog, claiming he was a regular customer and that no one had ever questioned him about it before. He demanded to speak to a manager right away. His face had turned red, and his dog actually stopped bouncing around to look at him. Several customers turned to stare at the commotion. Just then, my shift lead walked over. Having heard the shouting, she asked if everything was all right. The man immediately complained that I was discriminating against him and his service animal. I tried to apologize for any offense while explaining that I was simply informing him of our policy since his dog didn't have any service animal identification. He angrily retorted that he wasn't required to show any identification and that it was against the law to ask for it. At this point, the elderly customer who'd noticed his card earlier spoke up from her nearby table. She introduced herself as someone who trains service dogs for veterans and explained that legitimate service animals are required to be leashed in public spaces and typically don't climb on furniture. The man's face went from red to purple. He grabbed his dog, left his untouched cappuccino on the table, and stormed out. As he left, he shouted that he would report all of us, calling the situation unacceptable. As he reached the door, he tried to make a dramatic exit, but ended up walking straight into the service animals only sign, causing it to swing wildly. Later, the elderly customer came up to the counter to order another coffee. She praised my professional handling of the situation and commented that some people just can't handle being called out on their entitlement. True to his word, we never saw him again. A few days later, we did receive a complaint through corporate, but when they reviewed our security footage, they actually commended me for handling the situation professionally while enforcing store policy. The elderly customer became a regular, and she always brought pictures of the service dogs she was training to show us. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.